So as you can probably imagine, this event is a collaborative effort. And it's myself, it's Jelani, it's Rashid, but it's also a group of incredible advisors, including Sarita Gates, who you just heard from. Sarita Gates, Shamira Ibrahim, Bakari Kitwana, and Danielle Smith. So all of those individuals played a huge role in shaping what we've been doing these past couple days. And I also wanted to shout out Jayson Rodriguez, and he may not be hearing me saying this, but he's played a really big role in helping us define what kind of conversations would be relevant now. What we were really hoping to do as we developed this event was to get not just a series of conversations that would celebrate our history and celebrate some of the heroes of the past and celebrate people like Greg Tate who continue to be relevant and important to all of us, but also to ask the questions that are most relevant to journalists working now. And the question that we're going to be working with in our next conversation is, what does it mean to be a critic when Stan culture has made it such that it is incredibly difficult to actually speak truth to a particular kind of power in a particular context without getting doxxed, let's say? And how does that relate to the history of hip-hop journalists who have been targeted over time? Because we have a long history of not just hip-hop journalists, all kinds of journalists who have been targeted for doing their work. So I think maybe I'm not seeing the panel here present right now. So I'm going to give us just one moment, and I'm going to find out where they are, and I'll be right back. But thank you all for being here, and a big, big thank you to Greg Tate's family. We so appreciate you. So grateful for your partnership on this. And also just wanted to remind you about the QR code and liner notes. Oh, there he is. Okay, here we go. Here we go. I have a panel. This is hip hop. This is what happens. So I want to welcome Jayson Rodriguez, one of our key wonderful collaborators in developing this event. Jayson, thank you so much. And he's going to take it away and introduce the critic and the stan. Thank you.
Check, 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 check. Everybody can hear me? All right, all right. That's a little sleepy. If you're having fun, let me say yeah. Yeah. All right. So this is the concluding panel of Word Life. And I'd like to think of this as a bookend panel. Yesterday, Chris X was in conversation with Black Thought, and that was the critic and the artist. And so today, or right now rather, we're going to do the critic and the stan. And so what I'm hoping we can do is sort of trace that relationship from yesterday's panel to today. Obviously, with all these great panels today, it's probably going to morph a bit because there's probably so many thoughts that all the panelists have from all the great people that preceded us, so that'll probably get mixed into this conversation. But let me invite the panelists up so we could start this conversation. So I'll introduce you. If you're not happy with my introduction, I'm going to try and make it brief. Please fill in all the gaps. But first, we have Jesse Washington. He was the founding editor-in-chief of Blaze Magazine, also worked on staff at Vibe Magazine. Peace, brother. Next up, we have, I haven't met everybody, so I can't even see everybody that we have. Next up, we have Jouelzy. I can't see. Here we go. Jouelzy, video commentator, YouTube creator. And then we have Rawiya Kameir, Pitchfork contributing editor, also has written for places like The Fader. And last but certainly not least, Jay Smooth. Pioneering vlogger with the Ill Doctrine, co-host of the longest New York radio show, The Underground Railroad, and recently worked on Think Twice, the Michael Jackson podcast. So we'll get into that. Yeah, so everybody, again, another round of applause. I don't have my glasses, but hopefully I get this right. So first of all, I wanted to begin with something, just table setting with the idea of reviews and album critiques in hip hop. And I think something that makes it different, obviously when we talk about like the source, there's the mics and the way that it was branded. So, you know, with the great work that was happening earlier at the Village Voice, you know, it was these critiques and, you know, very thoughtful prose. But when you get to the rap magazines, it's, you know, but how many mics did it get, right? And, you know, that kind of enters into like barbershop lexicon, and that's where you kind of get to debate. obviously at that time, the distance between the writer and the artist was, it was a very short bridge to cross. So, they were reading the same magazines that we were writing. And so I want to start with you, Jesse, and sort of, if you could take me through the idea of, rap magazines and how they branded the album reviews. Certainly with you at Blaze, you got to do something a lot different. We even had artists clap back if they were unhappy, in more ways than one, which we'll get into. But just take me through the history from your point of view, rap magazines and rap ratings and what that album review meant.
Yeah, man, they meant everything. And we would flip right to the albums because you didn't really know what was out until you got the source. And it's, oh, this is out. How many mics did it get? So it was a huge thing in the culture, huge barbershop debates about that. Nah, man, it should have been 4.5. Nah, man, blah, 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 blah. And so it was a big thing. Vibe magazine didn't have a numerical scale, but the reviews still carried a lot of weight. And when I got to Vibe in the late 90s, there would be friction over the reviews and artists would be mad and call up. This is when Alan Light was the editor and Sheena was the music editor. And I was always somebody who wanted to, if there was someone had a grievance, let's hear it out. So I ended up having conversations with artists about their reviews, and they had some good points. They were like, yeah, the review said blah, 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 but that's not even what I was thinking about. And so then when we started Blaze Magazine, and it was an era of intense competition, like all these people who I'm hugging here now, like I hated them back then. in a hip hop type of way, and we were taking subliminal shots at each other and everything. So I was like, man, how can, and it was great. I mean, they were doing great work. So how can we distinguish ourselves? And I sort of came on this thing where if we gave an artist a negative review, then we would give them the review in advance and allow them to respond and publish their response right next to the review itself. And it seemed like a great idea at the time, and it sort of went left.
So before we get into it sort of going left, what were some of those conversations that you had with artists during the Vibe era when they had you said their points were, some of them were good points.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the exact conversation or even the artists, but
even philosophically, you said they were intending to do this.
Yeah, so people would write a review and talk about, well, when the artist chose this type of music, then it didn't really fit with the aesthetic that we've expected from them and that they've built up over their career. And I remember an artist explaining their viewpoint for their musical choices in an album, and it just really making perfect sense. And so for a critic, a lot of times you're coming at it from a total era of vacuum. And there was a rule back then that if you had done a feature on an artist, you can't write the review or vice versa because you're like too close to them. And so, but sometimes that closeness can give you a better understanding. Menya's panel here where she talked about the review, she was so embedded in the culture and so close to the vibe of everything that was going on, even though she didn't know Nas personally, or Nasir, as she said, it was the next best thing. And so the artists just had really great points about their music, and I was like, this review shouldn't be a stamp or an edict, it should be a conversation in order to really give the full depth of it.
And I'm going to get into a specific review in a few minutes with Rawiya, but I want to speak with Jay, because then I want to talk to Jesse's kind of famous artist feedback moment with cannabis. So if we're talking about the idea of reviews and their importance, Minya touched on it a little bit earlier with Nas and Illmatic, but the build up for debuting artists, right? Certainly Nas had his recent ones are like Drake and Jeezy and 50 Cent, Snoop. Helped me set the table for cannabis at that time. And there was his expectations. He was on the Lost Boys record, had a bunch of a guest feature run, the LL Cool J record, stuff he was doing on Clue mixtape. So take me to sort of what the precedence was, what people were awaiting at the time for a cannabis review.
That's such a good example of the many thoughts that this has been sparking for me. Let me say how grateful I am to be here with all these people and how just precious and nourishing this feels to really be together in community, especially coming out of the pandemic, how important stuff like this feels. And I feel like so much of what we're talking about is the tug of war between art that starts off as giving us creative community, and then certain parts of it we figure out how to commodify, and then it's a tug of war between art as community and art as commerce and capitalism. And especially in this digital age, it just creates this whole Rube Goldberg machinery through which we're still trying to make those human connections, but it gets more and more complicated. And I think so much of what we're discussing in the evolution of hip hop, like cannabis, in that era, so many artists came up through crews. There was a crew of MCs that introduced them, and in that sort of community of artists, they helped give this person a platform. And that was right at the time that I think what we thought of as hip hop journalism was continuing to evolve from, of course, first we had folks my age grew up idolizing and looking up to Greg, Nelson. I would even include Armand White in that, as eccentric as he was. You know, he was very early writing seriously about hip hop. And then those of us who felt like we were this hip hop generation, we became hip hop writers, and it was really important to us to represent and talk to the world about this thing we were so proud of. And as Minya said, like, we all came from it, wanted to be in it, and the writing was a part of that in a way that I think made for some beautiful writing, and also became complicated over the years because we were in such a place of we want to represent this thing we're a part of, that I think younger artists would sometimes feel as if our role was almost like they were the president and we were their press secretary. So as we kept evolving and sort of developing more critical distance, and I think that made for complications in how artists were receiving our work, which I think, you know, Jesse's experience will speak to that powerfully. But yeah, getting back to cannabis, I think that was peak era of being introduced to the world through your crew and having this hip hop journalist space that people really still took stock in, and you could go to these magazines and see who was the next up and really trust these voices telling you that in a way that I think is a lot more fractured now.
And then I want to draw a parallel between sort of the Cannabis Review and then the Lizzo Review, and that feedback, I guess, is the best phrase I'm going to use. If something better comes up, please share that. But so, you know, Cannabis debuting artist, a lot of buzz. He was, you know, touted as next. And so this album review, and to your point, Jesse, everybody went straight to the back to look for this album review. It was a negative review. History probably treats that accurate, but at the time, you had a confrontation with Wyclef, who, you know, was executive producer of the album, and I imagine it was because of the dynamic that the magazine has so much power to kind of set the narrative.
I would like to think that. So what had happened was, Cannabis was like that dude, that lyrical. By the way, my creative judgment is, as editor-in-chief of this new magazine, one of my moments that I'm least proud of is we had a test issue, and the choice was Cannabis or DMX. And I was like, nah, Cannabis. I was one of these rapidy rap type, you know. I did wear a backpack here today. And DMX, I was like, nah, it's too commercial, yeah, whatever. So there was that. But this album was highly anticipated, and it was trash because the beats was too, for lack of a better term, Wyclef-y. You know what I'm saying? It was like guitars and stuff, and like we wanted that boom bap. And the album was whack. And so we wrote the review. My man, shout out to my man, Dawi Chow, who is, you know, now still an eminent figure in the culture. And we sent it over there like, yeah, okay. We had done these things with and had a back and forth with a couple of artists who had responded to reviews, and we were printing them. So I didn't really think much of it until Dawi came up and was like, yo, man, them dudes is hot. They just had a conversation with me, boom, boom, boom. And so I was like, all right, let's go talk to them. So we go over to the Hit Factory, and we go in there, and it's Clef, Praz, Cannabis, and I was introduced to a gentleman, and he said, yeah. And Clef said, this is Haitian Jack. He never killed anybody who didn't deserve it. That was the intro. Now, I knew Haitian Jack already, and they sit down and start harassing me about this review. And I'm holding my ground. I was there with Dawi and my man Boots, and they start harassing me about this thing, and the album's not done. Then why'd you give it to me then? Well, now we doing this and we doing that. Yeah, but the album you gave me is what we reviewed, and we're going back and forth. And they were trying to punk me, really. And Clef of all people, but he figured, oh, I got this Ivy League sucker over here. He's not really with it, you know. And so at one point, and I found out later that in the other room of the studio was the Source crew. So I don't know if it was Selbum, but I'm pretty sure Carlito was there, and Riggs, Morales, like the guys who I love now, but like they were the enemy. And so I think he was going back and forth like, yeah, watch me play this chump out. So he comes back, puts a 9 down, and a bottle of liquor, and he's blah, blah, blah. And Clef is in my, Jack is in my ear saying, this never happened. None of this ever happened. And then Clef is like, whatever, and he points the gun at me. And at that point, I jump up, yo, what are you doing, blah, blah, blah. There's a little bit of a fracas. I knew that he wasn't going to shoot me. We're in the hit factory, dog, like, really? But he was, it was a challenge. So we argued for a while, and then we went home, and that was that experience. And it was the debut issue of Blaze. There was a lot of heat about it. So I decided to write an editorial about what he had done. So like, oh, you're gonna play me? I'm gonna come with the pen and clap and write back at you.
And then so that's table setting. So for Rawiya, if I'm mispronouncing your name, please correct me.
I'm gonna gently correct you. It's Rawiya.
Rawiya. So thank you. So I wanted to talk about your experience with the Lizzo review. And so you wrote this review for Pitchfork, which I historically I think stands the test of time, is accurate as well. And for that feedback loop, she took offense to it, but also her fan army. And so whereas in the past for Jesse, he's getting sort of confronted discreetly or back room, for you it was a very public kind of experience. And I think that's obviously very unique to the times and something that Jesse hasn't experienced. But I wanted to touch on this changing nature of that, right? Like there's a different, again, to Jesse's experience, I think it was the leverage or the dynamic of what the institution and title could do. The fan reaction to it is a little different, right? And again, to table set, obviously Stan, is an obsessive fan, right? And so they have their interests that are in line with the artist. So what, from your perspective, what did you view as their intent with their feedback?
Well, I don't know that I can assign intent necessarily, but, and I can't believe I'm about to admit this in public, I was a huge Cannabis fan, and I definitely defended him on a lot of message boards back in the day. So maybe it all, maybe I earned...
What's that username?
You'll never know.
Cannabis could rap though. Like his album was terrible, but he can and still can. He can rap, for the record.
Appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. On behalf of the Cannabis stands, yes, we exist. Anyway, by the time I wrote that Lizzo review, I had had many encounters with stan armies. Ironically, the Eminem stans are the most vicious. You write one sentence about Eminem in a piece that has nothing to do with him, and it gets violent in your email. So by the time the Lizzo stuff started happening, I was kind of inured to it. I didn't really initially think twice. Typically what happens when there's a sort of cycle of fan feedback, let's call it, is that I'm alerted because people I know are being very kind to me in the text messages. So I'm like, oh, someone else is mad at me, right? I've turned off my notifications. I can't confront it. So by the time I sort of figured out what the conversation was, it occurred to me that the difference this time around was that Lizzo had made two very specific points. It wasn't just sort of a general response to a piece of criticism that she didn't like. It was that, one, this isn't a job that should exist. And two, if you are not a person who makes music, or at least who makes music for consumption by the public, your authority is automatically diminished. And I don't know. I mean, I can recognize in retrospect that I have been affected by the public nature of it. It sort of went from visibility, which is useful and valuable, to what feels more like surveillance. I've written a lot less since then. I decline a lot of critical reviews. But I do think that the power of the stan isn't sort of in service of the music, right? What makes it different from the fan is that the stan can very easily be mobilized in service of whatever commodification is occurring, right? So it's more about using the fan and sort of or the stan rather, and sort of extracting labor from them in service of hitting #1 on the charts. So it makes me a little bit more cynical than the sort of, back in my day, we just used to anonymously praise cannabis on the internet.
It's interesting because what you're saying about cannabis is a lot. Your review had that. It was for the "Cause I Love You" album, and you clearly stated that she's talented. I think you even went out your way to like notice like all the good moments, like individual moments in every song exist, but the execution just wasn't there. And you know that feedback, like you said, it comes in service of something that's totally unrelated to the piece of work. And then for you, Jouelzy, the reason I'm bringing that up is you made a video that says Lizzo's easy to critique, and a lot of you talked about her presentation, which speaks to kind of her execution. And you know, she kind of has this role where she's really trying to do two things at once, right? Like she has her missive with body positivity, but also her music. She often intertwines the two, and in ways which, when you're writing about the music, the kind of Stan Army kind of responds to things that are unrelated to that, that points towards this bigger mission that she has, as if that can kind of inure her to criticism. Can you talk a little bit about that video and the reason why you made it?
Yeah, but I think, you know, is my mic on? I think part of this conversation, though, like when we talk about Stan culture in particular, you know, specific to the video I did about Lizzo was more so a conversation about her not making music for black people, her not making black music, and that sort of social media critique, not a critique coming out from a journalist. But, you know, in my thinking about this Stan conversation, I'm constantly thinking about how did the Stan come to be, and why has the Stan in this day and age become so powerful? Why does the Stan now have so much sway in our music and pop culture? And in part of my mind, I'm thinking there was a decline in support that musicians get from the record label side. And with the rise of social media, a lot of the artists are engaging this sort of fan base into the Stan momentum and really sort of encouraging them to have this very like uncritical, blind support of the artist that constantly seeks to antagonize anyone who has anything to say that they just don't agree with the artist. So yeah, you know, Lizzo in particular was just more of like the way I saw her getting critiqued in pop culture, because she's sort of she's very much so is an anomaly of an artist. And so that's what I was talking about. But when I think about Stan culture, I'm much more interested in the idea of like, why now? Why they become such a thing that we, you know, can't run away from.
It's interesting too. You know, the critic sort of in the past, you had to have tough skin because, to your point, it's a public work that you're putting out of your own. Now you kind of almost need like a coat of arms because of the social media armies, or I think that's kind of like the noted vernacular that we use for them. I want to go back to you because you talked about how it affected your pursuit of work, right? And because it's an experience that's augmented now when you put something out. It's not just judging you for your work, but it's this experience that you have to involuntarily participate in. Can you just stretch that out a bit, and then, you know, to her point, sort of this idea of not intent, but, you know, the rallying that fan armies do, right, and how they work together, and it really puts you at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's a disadvantage, but when they like what you've said, they really, you know, I'm sure
getting them clicks.
Exactly, yeah, and that really can be an advantage in terms of a career, right? Like a lot of the publications that hire us nowadays really care about your social following, because they can use, you know, your following to amplify, you know, their stories as well, right? So it's kind of, I don't want to suggest that it only exists in a sort of one-sided way, but you know, I have no problem with receiving criticism. I don't enter a conversation. I don't approach a piece of writing thinking that it's the end all or be all. I'm just theorizing on the spot, and I have a deadline. That's what I'm concerned about, right? What makes it difficult, or what makes it more sort of insidious, is the sort of paranoia of, oh, well, someone could be looking at what I posted in 2007, and while I'm sure I stand by whatever it was, the same way I stand by whatever I wrote about cannabis in 1997, you know, it becomes a sort of emotional burden that you aren't prepared to necessarily take on, and a lot of that comes with the power that's assigned to the review or the piece of criticism by external forces. I think, and I don't mean this in a like Taylor Swift, I didn't expect to be nominated kind of, I never thought I would win kind of way. But I really don't think that much about my own opinion. I'm just one tiny little voice, and I'm having fun with it. I just want to have, the conversations that I had in the lunchroom with the boys in a way that helps me pay my rent. And I also, for the past 3 or 4 years, I've actually sort of transitioned out of the field, and I teach full time now. I teach at the Newhouse School in Syracuse, and my job there depends on being evaluated by students all the time. Like I live or die by what people think of me. So the issue isn't the criticism; it's the sort of assumption that a critic is arrogant or believes themselves to be the voice of authority. I'm just talking shit most of the time,
I wanted to get at that, the assumption of the critic, right? We all get into it for various reasons. There's a very true high-minded concept of what the critic is, and people pursue that. But then sometimes it's just the shit is jamming, and I gotta tell people this, right? Or to your point, like I can do this, and in transaction in return, I'll get this money for my rent, or to go towards my rent. I want to go around the horn and just speak to each of your personal entry into it, and what your pursuit is when you do criticism or commentary. Jay, I'll go with you first.
Okay, yeah, so I think the origins of me doing it partly begin right here. I started doing my radio show in 1991 on WBAI radio, and one of the first things that happened was someone named Bobbito Garcia took me under his wing, and I initially started hanging out with him at the Def Jam office on Elizabeth Street back at that time, and I was a very introverted, socially anxious kid, as Joan Morgan can attest to, because she was a teacher at my high school. But Bobbito was very generous about just letting me hang out in his office every day and just watching all these here, like Busta Rhymes would just walk in and chop it up. Evil D would be there every day before Black Moon came out. And pretty soon after that, he started bringing me up here, where he was still in the early stages of his show with Stretch Armstrong, who had just finished changing his name from Skinny Bones at that time. And he also, at the same time, personally connected me with all the record labels and connected me with someone named Rob Tulo at The Source magazine. So I started writing for The Source in 1991, and I just saw it as this opportunity to basically be in community with other people who love this music and are proud of it. Like, it was such a beautiful thing as someone who had grown up so isolated, to be welcomed into this community of practitioners and people who want to represent this and be in the midst of it. And I think over the years, that became a way to share the voice that hip hop gave me about other things going on in the world, but I always try to keep it grounded in this is something hip hop gave me, and sort of represent what I think are the best of those principles, though we never fully, perfectly embody those principles. But.
And then Rawiya, can you expound a little bit? I know you talked about it's fun and you liked it. Can you kind of go a little bit into why you chose to do it and how you view what criticism is?
Sure. I mean, in a lot of ways, I just kind of fell into it. I grew up in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, and I never thought I would get a visa to come to this side of the world. I didn't think I would have any formal interactions with the music that I cared about. So I was just writing sort of for fun and to sort of pretend to my parents like I was, being a good kid when I was just writing about records in my room. But when I eventually sort of moved to this side of the world and actually graduated from this school in a million years ago, I never thought that there was room for someone like me in the sort of music journalism world. It just happened. I broke my ankle at a show and spent a lot of time on Twitter in 2007 because of that. And so people just started asking me to write things, and I just sort of fell into it. And in many ways, it's really just an extension of what is happening in my texts, in my threads at any given moment, right? I'm writing about the music, but it's really more so about the other stuff that I'm thinking about. There are people who are way more qualified than me to, write about bass lines or, whatever. But I think the connection between music and sort of politics, culture, et cetera, is why I do it. There's also an element of it that sort of, the John Keats concept of negative capability where it's like I can't really explain it. It's there's a truth that goes beyond logic and beyond science, both in art and I think in criticism. So that's kind of my approach.
And then for you, Jouelzy, which is funny calling you that. For your commentary, to me, it feels very much who you are offline. And you know, and a lot of topics that you touch on. I mean, you go from high-minded to kind of lowbrow with same. It feels like the same approach. And then yours is interesting because you know, like Jay's talking about community, you're talking about threads, and for you, you're doing it directly on your platform. And I see some stuff has like 700 comments that are going through on that. For you, can you kind of talk about your transition to doing?
It's funny because you know me from my past life before I started YouTube, right? Yeah. So I was working in the music industry, and I was going back and forth between whether I wanted to work on the music industry side or whether I wanted to be like a writer. But I felt like everything was kind of collapsing, right? This is like 2010, 2011, and I left New York because I just didn't feel like fighting for my life every day. And then I like really got into being a YouTuber. And when I got into doing commentary, really the thing that I saw was that with like as the internet exploded and became such a huge part of our daily lives, and the transformation of the iPhone and social media apps, and you think we have so much more access to information, there's like a huge anti-intellectual movement happening. And we understood that it was happening, and this radicalization thing was happening. The New York Times has covered it, but it's always covered from the angle of like this young white boy in middle America being radicalized into like a neo-Nazi. And I think maybe now we understand it because there's too many podcast mics in the Black community, but there is a huge like
put a tax on microphones.
Yeah, there's a huge anti-intellectual movement targeted, disinformation movement. We know that coming out of like the 2016 elections, but like I kind of got on a little bit earlier because there's this huge disinformation and anti-intellectual movement targeted at Black Americans or Black people at large. And then specifically the way that it's targeted at Black American women is often through relationship, dating, and beauty discourse. And so I just started hosting conversations where we can have these more like critical intellectual conversations and really challenge people to become more critical thinkers, but without like trying to hit them over the head. So rather than say, hey, go read Hortense Spillers, I was like, okay, well, I will take the themes from that and integrate that into like how we talk about, I don't know what themes I constantly bring up that reference, but like how we are like not named in the record, and so like how we are consuming things and upset that we are not visible and that there's not language for the things that we're dealing with, but do that through a pop culture lens, right? So whatever it might be happening, the Puffy thing that just happened, bringing that back into the more theoretical stuff that like Black intellectuals online will constantly name all the people they've read, but who has time to go back and read all of Foucault's books? I tried to like weave that into a more pop culture discourse to just broaden this space and push back essentially against the disinformation that is happening on the internet.
And then you do it because it's fun, or like what's your reason for your pursuit?
The liberation of my community. Yeah, I have a like I want to challenge this idea that like what's my role? Like what am I bearing witness to, and then how am I engaging in it sounds so. Yeah, it sounds crazy to say, but yeah, really am committed to the community aspect of, not wanting my people to be suffocated out or, or participate in that in their own suffocation.
And then you, Jesse, your initial pursuit into your career and I guess, your North Star for how you approach it.
Yeah, what you said about the liberation of my people really resonates because I think that was what it was for me, but I didn't recognize it. I was too young. But I knew that there was this thing called hip hop, and I started DJing in 1986, and there's been a number of moments during this tremendous series of events here where we talked about what the media landscape was like for hip hop. It was hostile and ugly and disrespectful, and I mean there was a great panel about feature writing that the professor had earlier where he's quoting these New York Times stories, and they were just ridiculously out of touch. So I'm a journalist, this is my life's work, and I have something that I love. I want to proclaim it and champion it And so I got an internship in the New York Times in 1989, but there's nothing I want more than to write for the source. Like, forget the New York Times, I want to be over here. And another part of it, and Jay, you mentioned it, is community. And at that time, hip hop was a crew. Like, because everybody was against us. The New York Times was against us, Rolling Stone was against us. We were disrespected all the time, so I wanted to represent. In another way, I wanted to be down. And I'm a journalist, and even though I'm a DJ and I'm a party DJ, whatever, but there was these amazing writers that I saw, and I was like, wow, how can I be down with them? And I made it my business to, I pitched the source. There's a lot of source pitch stories here, so I was probably around 8 or 9 before they were like, yeah, okay. You know, you could, and so, and then it turned into championing this thing that I love, and then really also, it's about the liberation of our community, and over time it turns into, and still to this day, like, as a commentator and a critic or whatever you want to call it, on hip hop and on sports in my current role, which is very intertwined, it has become, and it always has been about, like, okay, yeah, man, if you rockin', we're gonna go with you and we're gonna hold you up for everybody. But if we step off track, we have to say something. Like, we can't just be a blind follower as journalists. And I always really sort of brought that ethos to it, like, we're gonna call it straight like it is. You can't buy us, you can't influence us, you can't intimidate us, you can't scare us. We gotta come with what's real and what's true. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Take that, Wyclef. So you mentioned, you know, you can't intimidate us or influence us, but you also said champion, right? And I think a lot of us for music journalism, hip hop journalism, you know, there's this sort of intense want to champion our favorite artists or our favorite genre or subgenres, which obviously it's the language of the fan, right? And so I'm just throwing this out for the group, jump in as you see fit, but you know, explain your relationship to fandom, right? Like, are you currently still a fan? Is that something that you had to put to the side? Do you think of yourself as above fandom? Are you adjacent to it?
Real quick, before y'all get into it, I'm not a fan. I'll never be a fan. I've never taken a picture with a rapper. I've wrote books for people I've never taken pictures with. You know, and that's my stance with it. I'm not a fan. I'm not your fan. I might respect your music. I might disrespect your music in print if it's disrespectful, but I'm not your fan.
I think it's hard to be a fan right now. You know, to get political, like, we're literally watching a colonial warfare happen with the genocide in Palestine. We are literally watching, like, a very violent, rapid colonization happen and the eradication of a nation of people. And just to watch it, and then for me to watch how many, like, Black influential, whether they're intellectuals, whether they're pop culture people, are so ready to, like, push this conversation into either a matter of electoral politics or just a thing that, like, we should be ready to move past. And how much of the discourse, particularly in the Black digital landscape, is about, okay, well, historically this has always happened, but who sets the historical precedent that this should be repeated? Like, there's all, and so it's like, I think we're at a very critical moment that feels like I'm literally just watching my community be ready to die, essentially, like, to say, okay, well, you know, we're not, whatever. So it's hard to then say, okay, well, in this very critical moment, I'm going to, like, be a fan even when I see these very influential and wealthy and powerful people who have invoked the visual discourse and imagery of Black radical movements as part of their artistry, and then they're very silent in this moment. Why would I maintain, like, I can't understand that. I can't have the knowledge of that. I can't be the person that I am and then maintain, like, being this fan. That doesn't mean I no longer enjoy any art, but, like, being a fan and being unbiased and uncritical in my fandom, no, that doesn't, you can't do that anymore right now.
I think that really raises some interesting points, to put it diplomatically, because I don't think being a fan equals being uncritical and unbiased. If that's how we're defining it, then I am no fan. But I actually think fans can be the most effective critics, the most thoughtful and loving critics, as someone mentioned on an earlier panel.
Mania.
But there you go. But when you know, fan as as a personal identity as opposed to fan as social position. Those are two very different things, right? And I was reading, unrelated but related, I was reading this book the other day, a novel, and in it one of the characters describes themselves as, they say something along the lines of, I'm a nobody, I'm a fan. And if being a fan means being a nobody, then that means what? We should all be stars. But if everyone is a star, then who's left to be a fan, right? In some ways, I fear that the direction of that social fan as social position is kind of like the fallacy of like exponential growth that capitalism gives us. It can't happen for everyone. Everyone's not going to be a billionaire, but everyone's not going to be a star, right? So I feel some amount of pride in being a fan. That being said, as a journalist, there are many stories that I'll decline, if I can indeed call myself a fan. So I think it's worth thinking a little bit more about how we define it in the first place.
What about you, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have very similar thoughts. It all depends on how you're going to define the terms. I mean, I think I still have love for the music and the culture. Yeah, I might be too old to think of myself as a fan in the way I used to, but I think I loved the conversation about Greg Tate so much, and I think he was the ultimate model of how you can love your people and love your art and culture and love it by challenging it to be better. He was so fearless about doing that. You know, I worked on this Michael Jackson podcast, and one of the first things I did was go back to read everything Greg wrote, and it was bracing to me how hard he took it to Michael. Like when the Bad album came out, he did not dance around like, this album's kind of trash, y'all. He would always, but it was always with love, and he related to hip hop in that same way from the very early days. So I think it's hard not to feel alienated and disillusioned in some ways. As you said, I mean, I try to think of how many mainstream hip hop voices have spoken on this genocide in Gaza, and I'm hard pressed to think of too many. But it doesn't make me want to give up on pushing whatever part of hip hop is within my orbit to, try and live up to the values that we called ourselves representing. And, I referred briefly to us never perfectly embodying the ideals that we state as hip hop's principles. And as I listen to myself telling my stories of coming into the game and all this community, it's not lost on me that almost all the stories I'm telling are men bringing me into rooms of other men and building community that way. And one of the ways, and it took me a long time to be cognizant of that and be aware of it and try to actively counteract that. And I think that's important work for all of us to try to do. And I think as much as we can take a negative view of Nicki Minaj and her relationship with the Barbz based on what we've seen recently, I look at, I watched a little mini documentary about the Barbz, and it really hit me how, as well as being the worst, the Barbz are the best of what a fan community could be, because I see all these black women, black queer young people coming together, and these are exactly the people that our traditional, true to the culture hip hop spaces have never been as welcoming for or as safe for. So I think you can see both the best and the worst in something like that, of how there's a lot more ways to carve out space, and then there's a lot of complexity to how we try to connect this humanity through all this media capitalist machinery.
So I wanted to ask you, speaking of complexity as the pivot, the Michael Jackson podcast that you're referring to, that you worked on, called Think Twice. And I think about this idea, as Jouelzy said, I'll say it, Jouelzy. I want to call you something else, your real name. But for you, the idea of a fan, you're deeply invested in the catalog, the artist success, everything you're alluding to with the Barbz. But to be a professional or to be a critic or a commentary, you're also very much deeply looking at the music. And for your project, you're looking at Michael Jackson in a completely different way that's probably counter to the narrative that was really lionizing him as this pop superstar. And you're going beneath a layer, or two or three really, with this project. What is it that you think separates this idea of what you are pursuing, what you're looking for, compared to like this deeper thing that the Barbz are looking for, with this affirmation of Nicki and their identity and their participation in art?
Yeah, I mean, there was so much to wrestle with and sit with, going this deep into Michael Jackson's life and all the reverberations he had in our culture and society. And yeah, I mean, I think, well, I don't want to skip past the elephant in the room. I mean, he was credibly accused of what would be the worst possible abuse of power between an artist and a fan. And we definitely sit with that for several episodes of the podcast. But there's also so many other layers of insight throughout Michael's life of what it means to be a child who comes into having this outsized public voice, which in a smaller way every young person is doing now on the internet. You know, Michael was thrust into these adult spaces, these nightclubs and burlesque shows from such a young age, and then grows up with these holes inside him that he tries to fill through these sort of parasocial relationships with these fans, which creates some positive connections, but also really, I think, left both sides of it empty in a lot of ways. And it's one of the earliest examples, I think, of a fandom that develops around being devoted to this avatar and wanting to be protective of that avatar, to the point that so many years after he passed, there's a very active community that their whole sense of identity and belonging. And, you know, it's funny, the original Stan in the song, his standum plays out in isolation, like he's in a basement writing Eminem, and it's kind of implied that that isolation helps put him over the edge. But in real life, standum is almost always people looking for community with other Stans, looking for a sense of belonging, identity, and I think that's an early example with Michael of people who, especially in this media landscape where all the social media incentive is to take sides and either love or hate, like all these gears are grinding towards making people be protective and almost be the foot soldiers of their fave in a way that can get real complicated.
I want to ask a quick follow-up, and then I want to go to the group for closing remarks so we can kind of get back on track with the schedule. But the finale episode, I feel like the Stans took that as a betrayal almost, because you rendered a judgment that Michael's in fact guilty of all the things that mainstream media probably just alluded to his guilt, or a lot of times they stood by. He was never convicted. But
not to say we didn't state as a fact, but we were frank about our personal perspective. That's what we came to believe.
And I think the Stans kind of took that as a betrayal for, there's this historical project you're doing, you're looking to his life, and then at the end, and not saying that this is my opinion of it, but I do think that they felt broadsided because they were looking for just this affirmation and celebration. And I think that's sort of like the delineating kind of factor when you think of a Stan, right? Like they want the end to land in a way that they think speaks to kind of the highness of what their favorite artist is.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, so all of the incentive structure in social media, you don't get likes or shares or clicks for expressing nuance or ambiguity or shades of gray. You decisively take sides and either love or hate something, and that's what you get rewarded for. And that over time wires our brains to seek out ways to engage with everything that way and interpret whatever we take in as either one or the other. And one of the things that means is when a fan base sees you speaking about their fave with shades of gray, they're going to take that as hate because everything is either hate or straight up raving for somebody. And that's a difficult space for a critic or anyone who wants to think seriously about any of this to be in. First of all, because you're not getting as many clicks on your project from the shades of gray, and half the people who do click are going to take it as one extreme or the other. Oh, I want to shout out Kieran Mayo, who was a great contributor to the podcast, by the way, if you listen to the Wiz episode.
And then to close, I want to start with Jesse and then kind of come back around. I'm going to ask two questions just in the interest of time. Just answer one. Either your idea about the future form of criticism, whether that's a medium or something as small as a word count, or the future sort of relationship between a critic and Stan, fan army, or fans.
I think the future form has to be based on bravery and as these folks have all tackled really difficult, uncomfortable subjects and are bring the Stans, bring the label, whoever. I want to share something for 2 minutes, and I've never really told this story publicly, and I want to say it here amongst my mentors and my peers and my tribe. And so I think one of the things that I'm known for the most at Blaze Magazine, other than dope covers, is me ending up in the hospital over something that was in the magazine. And what had happened was that there was an artist, D. Angeletti, aka the Mad Rapper, who had a Mad Rapper album coming out. And there's this tension between criticism and commerce, because we all are writing this criticism for platforms. What happens when we have to criticize the people who pay those platforms' bills? And so this feature proposal was brought to me. Write a feature about his album by Keith Clinkscales, who ran the magazine. I immediately knew there was some money behind it. I ascertained independently, asked my man Daryl Dawsey, features editor, is this a story? Yeah, it's a good story. Okay, let's do the feature. Interview with D. Check. Photo shoot with D. Check. As we're waiting for the album to come out.
And it's D. as the Mad Rapper,
As
right?
the Mad Rapper, you know. But I mean, what's the difference though?
I didn't know if this was sort of like the unmasking of it.
Nah, you know, in my opinion, he did a photo shoot with no mask on.
Gotcha.
Bro, you unmasked.
Yeah.
And so he had a single coming out. We put it in the singles review column. D's Cuts was the title of the joint. My man Mike Housworth got at it, and most of the reviews of the single were bad. All of a sudden, he's on the phone super hot, as is my practice. I'm like, well, come on down and we could talk about it. We go to the conference room on Lexington Avenue, Vibe Magazine. I go up there. He comes in with 3 of his boys, and I leave on a stretcher and wake up in the hospital. And so that's what happened. And so I think that the future of criticism is really, I mean, obviously that's a far out worst case scenario, and I don't think or want or expect that to happen to anybody. But over the course of the next 20 years, I've seen so many instances of people really not being afraid to say what's really on their mind about people that they love. And again, just to bring it back to Greg Tate, if you can do it with an atmosphere of love and respect, but also just not being, not bowing down to the pressure, I think that that's really the future of what's going to keep criticism alive.
Thanks. Jouelzy, and for you, we should clap for that. Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it. Jouelzy, for you, what do you think is the future relationship between the critic, commentary, and the stan?
That's a tough question. I think the internet is going to become a much more violent place. As we just see, platforms are being bought out, the way journalism is going. I think for people that are going to engage in being critical of artists and thinking about how stan culture is going to continue to be mobilized. And I know you can give grace to the Barbz, but I am a little concerned for sort of the internet abuse that they engage with, and just how the huge artists like Nicki sort of she just tweeted something yesterday about don't mess with them, they're going to take it personal, and they have the right to take it personal in the face of them doing sort of very violent things to people on and off the internet. But making sure that being brave in your criticism, being thoughtful in it, but also ensuring that you have community offline, because part of maintaining your safety is going to be your ability to log off and be in a space of care. Because I just see so much of the internet, whether it's the way TikTok quickly reproduces outrage and really encourages it, the way safety parameters have basically been removed from Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And so the way that the stan culture is going to continue to be mobilized, unless somehow there's some legal or carceral process that can happen, which I don't have a lot of faith in. So I want to encourage people to just be thoughtful and be brave in their criticism, but also don't invest so much on the online portion of it that you aren't set up to take care of yourself, in your material reality.
No, thank you for that. Rawiya, right? Did I pronounce it correctly that time?
So close.
Rawiya. I'm gonna get it. I'll probably get your username on the message boards correctly before I get your name right. But I apologize for that. I promise I will get it correct soon. For you, how do you see the future form of criticism? You're obviously a professor and teaching writing to young students. What do you see as sort of the future form and shape, and what does that look like to you?
I mean, I think it's really just about continuing to connect the dots, right? When you're talking about Beyonce, you're never just talking about Beyonce. When you're talking about critics being harassed by Barbz on the internet, you're also talking about the more than 100 plus journalists targeted and killed in Palestine, right? All of these things are connected, and I think sort of making it safer to as Jay says, have room for the gray area is really what our role is, what the role of criticism is. Whether it happens, on YouTube or in print magazines or whatever the form takes, I think the important thing is sort of moving past the classic or trash binary and sort of, we're on a spinning rock. None of this makes sense, right? So how can we help make sense of the world? That's the best we can offer, I think.
And Jay, I'll ask you to finally make sense of the world with this last question.
Oh boy.
No, but for you, you've experienced multiple mediums, radio, Ill Doctrine with your video series, the MJ piece, writing. For you, whether it's the future form of it or the relationship to the Stan, what do you see as sort of the next evolution, if you can offer any insight to an incredibly large question? Yeah,
that's definitely a big question. I would definitely echo what Jouelzy was saying. When I said the Barbz are the best and the worst, I definitely meant both ends of it. And what we've seen with her encouraging her fans to go after people, as this thing with Megan played out, has been really disturbing to me. And I think, I don't know, we've got a lot of work to do, especially as older folk, to stay tapped into this sort of thing, because there's so many streamers and young people who have built a really deep connection with millions of kids online that a lot of folks my age don't even know who someone like Kai Cenat is, and there are people way more toxic than him. Like, there's so many straight up sociopaths that are top YouTubers nowadays, and there's almost no mediation or presence of any elders to guide either side of it through.
YouTube just loosened their policy around dis and misinformation, so it's just going to get worse.
Yeah. So I would say we need to stay connected to that and try to just be present and aware of whatever our younger generations are getting into and try to learn from it and contribute. We don't want to repeat the same mistake. Like, you can remember the first 10 or 20 years of hip-hop developing, our parents didn't want anything to know about it for the most part. Then after a certain part, they wanted to come in and tell us things we were doing wrong. But okay, you had 10 or 15 years to be here guiding us through that. Or if you show up now, it's a little hard for us to take that too seriously. So I think we need to not make that mistake with all of the many forms of media these younger generations are taking in, and try to help each other figure out safe distance and ways to really connect with each other's humanity through all this machinery.
Yeah, no, for certain. So for everybody out there, I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us. If I could get a note for all the Columbia students who are here, I just want to say, 20 years ago, I was in the journalism program at NYU downtown, and to see this be here on your campus, it's mind-blowing to me. I had a lot of support when I was a student, but in today's parlance, I didn't feel very seen when I was pursuing it. I probably dressed exactly the same then as I do now. And I felt like that made me stand out in a way that made me not kind of fit in. And so to see something that's celebrating hip hop journalism at Columbia University, premier journalism school in the country, an immense major salute to Dean Jelani Cobb for bringing that here to the campus. And also major props to Liz Mendez-Berry and Rashid Shabazz with Critical Minded for all their pursuits and support in doing this. I cannot thank you guys deeply enough for just being a part of this and seeing all these wonderful faces. And last but not least, thank you to the panel here for all your insight and participating in it. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.